Could you please state your name for the record?
Annie Morrison.
And Ms. Morrison, where do you currently live?
I live in a suburb outside of Chicago, Illinois.
Did you fly down here at our request?
Yes, I did.
Do you know an individual by the name of Leon Jacob?
Yes.
How do you know him?
He's my ex-husband.
I want to walk you back in time to when you first met the defendant in this case. When did you first meet him?
I met Leon in 1996 at the University of Texas at Austin.
Were you both students there?
Yes.
And did you begin dating right away?
Pretty much right away, yes.
While you were at the University of Texas and you're dating the defendant, talk to us about your relationship early on.
Sure. Our relationship was fun. Leon was very spontaneous. We had a good time together. It was also volatile. When we fought, they were big fights, lots of screaming. There were, incidents where he threw my clothes off the balcony of his apartment complex. Like I said, lots of screaming. So it was up and down.
When you're dating him in college, looking back now, hindsight's 20/20, but were there some flags back then that maybe you kind of overlooked?
Yes, I think so. Looking back now, I think the screaming was one of them.
Responsive, That's over.
Thank you. The screaming, it was intense, and it was in my face, screaming. Certainly throwing my clothes over his balcony. And then I think Leon was somebody who people either really warmed up to quickly and loved, or...
What was the defendant's personality like back then?
He was very brash, very in your face, had a very big personality.
Did you date all through college?
Yes.
And after college, did you all eventually get married?
Yes, we did.
When did you get married?
In December of 2001.
During that time, were the two of you living together?
Yes, we were.
Okay. Where was the defendant living?
We were living in Grenada. He was in medical school there, and we were living there.
And did you stay there with him the whole time that he was in medical school there?
No.
Where did you go?
I stayed there for a semester after we were married, and then went back to the Chicago area for the summer. And after the summer was over, I went to New York to go to law school.
The two of you during that time period still obviously communicating, still married, all that kind of stuff?
Yes.
At some point, did the defendant join you in New York?
Yes, he did.
What was he doing in New York during that time?
He was completing the last few years of medical school, so he was doing rotations at a hospital.
Do you know how it was going for him in medical school at that time?
As far as I knew, it was going well.
Did there come a time when you all were living in New York where the fights escalated and where you became more fearful of the defendant?
Yes, there was a time that we got into a fight, and he pulled a knife on me.
Okay, tell us about that.
I don't recall what the fight was about. I recall we were in our apartment, and he pulled out a pocket knife, is how I would describe it, where the blade flipped out, and he held it up. I don't recall what he said, but I recall feeling threatened by it, and that he was threatening me with the knife.
What were you thinking when he pulled that knife on you?
I was scared. I was scared that he would come at me with the knife.
Did he eventually put the knife down?
He did, yes.
Did you tell anyone about what had happened or let the police know or anything like that?
No, I did not.
Why not?
It was surreal, if that makes sense. It felt like it couldn't really have happened, and I thought it was something that would never happen again. I wanted to believe it was something that would never happen again.
Did you all stay in New York?
We stayed in New York until 2006.
And then where did you go?
We came to Houston.
What did you come to Houston for?
We came for Leon to take a job at Baylor, a residency at Baylor.
Why didn't he stay in New York and complete his residency in New York?
His contract with the hospital was not renewed.
Do you know why it was not renewed?
I do not.
So when you come to Houston, do you all get an apartment or a home? Where do you live?
We got an apartment, yes.
And he's attending Baylor. What are you doing at the time?
I was working at a law firm.
So you're practicing lawyer at that time, taking the bar, all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Talk to us about your time down here in Houston. What year are we talking about approximately?
We lived in Houston from 2006 to 2010. During that time, we had one child in 2009. And subsequently, after having our first son, the arguments and the fights began to escalate again.
So prior to moving to Houston and him pulling the knife on you, in New York, had anything physical happen?
No.
And then you mentioned that you had a son with
Yes.
him. What changed once you had your son?
I think it was difficult for Leon to focus on something other than what he wanted to do. The responsibility, obviously having a child, is very great, and I think that was very difficult for him. He had a hard time giving up his freedom and his free time to do things that we needed to do for our family.
So during that time period, who's paying the bills?
I was.
And who's taking care of your son?
I was.
Who would do grocery shopping and home errands and things like that?
I did.
You mentioned while you were in college that he threw your clothes off the balcony. Did he do something similar to that when you were living here in Houston?
Yes, we got in an argument. We lived on the third floor of our apartment building, and he threw my clothes down the stairs. We lived close to the stairway. We were the end apartment, and he threw my clothes down the stairwell.
Were you concerned for your safety at this time?
Yes.
Why didn't you leave?
I was embarrassed. I was embarrassed that this was happening to me. I consider myself a pretty strong person, and I didn't want anyone to know that this was happening. We also had a son together, and I was concerned about, I grew up with both my parents. I was concerned about my son growing up in a broken home and how difficult that would be for him. And I was in love with Leon, and I wanted to believe that things would change.
Did he continue while you were in Houston to get more and more physical with you?
Yes. Yes.
Describe that for me.
He would push me, grab my arms or my shoulders, kick me, push me against the wall.
Would he leave bruises?
Yes.
Would people ask you about those?
Sometimes, yes.
And what would you tell them?
I lied. I would make something up and say that I had bumped my arm or bumped my leg against a table or a wall or something like that.
He slammed your face hard enough on that counter that he actually left bruises.
Yes.
Did he ever threaten you?
Yes.
Okay, tell me about that.
He threatened that if I ever left, that he would kill me. He said that nobody would ever find my body because he was a doctor and he had access to chemicals that would dissolve my body. He said if I ever left, that he would find me and the children and take my children, and I would never see them again.
Did you believe him when he made these threats to you?
Yes.
Were you concerned about the safety of your son?
I was concerned that he would take my son and I would never see him again.
After your second son was born, did the defendant return to your home?
Yes.
And did you make an attempt to reconcile with him?
We separated for a period of time, maybe about 3 weeks. And then he did return home. We made an attempt to reconcile, and that's when we moved to Pittsburgh, partly because he wasn't working and my job was in Pittsburgh, and partly because it gave us distance between he and Patty.
So is it, at that point, was it your understanding that he and Patty Gooden were over?
That was my understanding.
So you mentioned you moved to Pittsburgh. Are you still working during that time period?
Yes.
Is the defendant working during that time period?
No.
Do you know what he was doing while you were working during the day?
I know he was drinking alcohol. He would frequent Rivers Casino in Pittsburgh, and he played a lot of online poker.
Was he spending a lot of money?
Yes,
Whose money was it? Who was bringing in the money?
I was.
When you say he was spending a lot of money, was it on alcohol and gambling?
Yes.
Do you recall about how much he spent gambling at the time?
I don't recall, but it was in the tens of thousands.
Was it that frustrating to you?
Yes,
Why was it frustrating?
because kids are expensive, life is expensive. That was money that I wanted to save, some of it to save, some of it was for daycare and food and clothing and rent. And it was all being given to the casinos and online poker. He was buying online poker chips and using the money for online poker as well.
Were your boys in daycare during that time period, or did they stay home with him?
They were in daycare.
How come you didn't just leave them at home with him?
I didn't trust him to take care of them. He was not engaged. He was always either at Rivers or on his phone. And at some point, I became concerned about the alcohol as well and wouldn't allow him to drive the kids anywhere.
So is it fair to say that during that time period, you're working, you're maintaining the house, you're taking care of the kids, and he's kind of off doing his own thing?
Yes.
Did there come a time where, once again, the violence kicked back up while you were in Pittsburgh?
Yes, very shortly after we moved there, the violence continued.
I want to talk to you about a particular instance when James was a baby, and I believe it was your birthday. Talk to me about what happened on your birthday.
Cash was a baby. James was about 3. The boys came in early in the morning on my birthday and climbed into bed. They wanted us to get up. I wanted to sleep in. But we got up, and I was not very happy with Leon about it. And I remember saying to him something about, it's my birthday, and I don't ever get to sleep in. It would be nice if I could sleep in one morning. And he got really angry. He pushed me into our guest room, which was across the hall from our bedroom. And he pushed me onto the bed and was screaming at me about wanting to go back to sleep. And he lifted the mattress while I was on the bed, and essentially I rolled off the bed onto the floor, and he sort of pushed the mattress on top of me, and then he threw a blanket and a pillow and said, "You can sleep there," essentially on the floor. After that, I stayed in the room for a while because I was scared. And after I got up, I realized he had gone back to bed. So
Unresponsive.
Let me stop you there. So you mentioned he went back to bed. Did he stay in bed for the remainder of the day?
he did.
I want to fast forward a little bit and talk to you about a time when you got upset about some keys, or when the defendant got upset about a set of keys. Talk to me about that.
That was about a week after my birthday, a little less than a week after my birthday. We had gotten in a fight in the morning as I was getting ready and getting the kids ready to go to daycare. He took my keys and my cell phone, and he took the blankets and pillows off our bed, and he laid in front of the front door and wouldn't
Okay,
give...
so I'm sorry. Let me stop you there. So he takes your keys,
Yes,
and he takes the sheets and pillows off your bed?
I believe it was a blanket and the comforter. He wrapped himself in the comforter and had a pillow.
And would he let you leave the house?
No,
So what did you do?
I called the police.
Did the police come?
Yes, they did.
And what happened once the police arrived?
They told him to give me my keys and my cell phone, which he did, and then they left.
So what did you do at that point?
I was able to get my younger son out of the house, and we went and drove around. I became concerned that my older son was still at the house, and I wanted to go back and try to get him.
Objection, Your Honor. Non-responsive. Sustained.
Did you go back to the house
I-
to get James?
I did.
What happened once you got back to the house?
I went upstairs, and both James and Leon came into the bedroom, and Leon pushed me onto the bed, and he pinned my arms up and put his knees on my elbows so that I couldn't get up. And he held I call it a knife. I think it's more of a razor, like a switch razor where you push a button and the razor comes up. He held that to my throat.
Okay, so let me get a better visual picture. How old is James at this point?
It's 3.
And you're on the bed in your bedroom, and you mentioned that your arms were pinned. So I have my hands above my head. Is this about how your arms were?
Yes.
And you mentioned that he had his knees on your elbows. So did he have a knee on each elbow?
Yes.
And then with that, he put the razor to your throat?
Yes.
Was James able to see what was going on?
Yes.
And was the defendant saying anything to you as he put that razor to your throat?
He was screaming at me, but I don't remember what he was saying.
You're scared?
Yeah.
Did he eventually get off of you?
Yes, he did.
Did you call the police then?
I didn't. He had told me that was essentially,
Non-responsive. Sustained.
What did the defendant tell you?
that if I ever called the police again, he would kill me. That was my punishment for calling the police, was being held in the bed with a knife to my throat.
So him putting that knife to your throat with James, your 3-year-old right there, that was retaliation for calling the police just a few hours earlier.
Yes.
Were you able to get away from him at that point?
I left the bedroom, and I went down to the baby's room to change him.
How old was the baby at this point?
5 months old? Not quite.
Okay, so you went down to the baby's room. Where's the defendant at this point?
I believe he was still in our bedroom. That's what I recall.
Okay. What happened once you went inside your baby's room?
Leon came and closed the door and barricaded the baby and I in the room.
Where was he? Where was the defendant? Was he on the other side of the door?
He was on the other side of the door.
And how did he barricade the door?
We still had moving boxes upstairs. We had only been in the house less than 2 months, I believe, at that point. He put those in front of the door. He also took James's mattress off his bed and put that in front of the door.
Is he saying anything to you as he's barricading you in this bedroom with your son?
I don't recall.
Is he letting you leave?
No.
Does he tell you anything about how you're going to leave?
He told me the only way I was leaving the house was in a body bag.
What are you thinking at this point?
I was thinking, how do I get out of a second-story room with a 5-month-old? I thought if I was by myself, I could go out the window and maybe crawl down, but I didn't think I could make it with a baby.
How long do you think he had you barricaded in that room?
As best I can recall, maybe 30 minutes.
Did he eventually let you out?
Yes.
Was there ever a time where you got into a fight and he would take off with one of the children?
Yes, he took off with James after a fight one time.
And were you concerned about James's safety?
I was. He was driving through Pittsburgh. I tried to follow them, but I lost them.
Based on the knife to the throat, the barricading in your room, telling you that the only way you're leaving the bedroom is in a body bag, did you start to take some steps to permanently leave the defendant?
I did.
What did you do?
I went and met with a lawyer the following morning. I called my mom from her office and asked my mom to come in so that the boys and I could go leave the house and stay at a hotel.
Okay, so let's stop there. You said you called her from the office. You mean you called her from your lawyer's office?
Yes.
Up until that point, did your mom have any idea what was going on between you and the defendant?
No.
Why hadn't you shared with your mom what was going on?
Because I didn't want my parents to know what was happening to me. I knew it would destroy them. And my dad had said to me, he's going to be violent.
Sustained.
Without saying what was said, was your dad concerned about the defendant around you?
Yes.
When you called your mom from that lawyer's office, did you ask her to come to Pittsburgh to help you leave the defendant?
Yes.
Why did you need her to come in order to leave him?
I was afraid that if I got a hotel room with my credit card, that Leon would be able to track us.
So, is it fair to say you were so scared of him that you were afraid to even use a credit card because he could find you?
Yes.
What other steps did you take in order to leave him at this point?
We stayed in the hotel for the weekend. I called his family and told them what had happened. They came up to Pittsburgh and brought him back to Houston, so I was able to get back into the house. And I began talking to my lawyer about how I could get out of my marriage.
Did you get any kind of protective order during that time period that you were in Pittsburgh?
I did in August of 2013.
And what was the purpose of getting that protective order? What prompted you to finally take that step?
I knew that we had to get out, that I had to get the kids out. The violence was still continuing. I was afraid for my safety and theirs. Ongoing yelling. I decided that my kids were better off without being in the same household with Leon.
That brings up a good point. Describe for us what kind of dad he was or what concerns you might have had about him parenting your two boys.
I had a lot of concerns about the drinking. I wouldn't allow the boys to get in the car with him. He was disengaged. He, even when he was doing things like putting the kids to bed, he was sitting there with his phone playing poker. He yelled a lot, even at the boys. And I remember my son would tell me things and he would ask me not to tell his dad because he didn't want his dad to get mad. And so I had concerns that the violence and the screaming and the general feeling of being unsafe was affecting my kids.
After he went to Houston, did he come back? Did he come
Yes,
back?
he did.
And did you make one last-ditch effort to try and make things work?
We did. I agreed to go to counseling with him.
And what happened with that?
We went to one session, and he agreed to go back to a second session. The first question from the therapist during that second session was, I don't remember the question, I just recall that Leon found it offensive, and he walked out. And that was the end of counseling.
And was that the end of your marriage?
I think our marriage was over long before then.
Did you decide or make a decision to leave Pittsburgh?
Yes, I did.
Where did you decide to go?
To Chicago, where my parents were.
Tell me about, did you take steps with your money and with your job in order to leave Pittsburgh and get safely to Chicago?
I did. In early August of 2013, I opened a bank account in my own name and did not put Leon on it, and I had my paycheck routed into that account because he had been draining our joint account, and I was afraid we would be left, the kids and I would...
Objection, Your Honor. Not responsive. Sustained.
What were you afraid of?
I was afraid the kids and I would be left with no money.
Did you make a decision to let him know that you were finally leaving him?
I made a decision to let him know about the bank account.
And did that result in you, well, tell me about that. Tell me about when you told him that you were rerouting your paycheck. How did that conversation go?
The night I told him, he didn't have very much of a reaction. He was annoyed, is how I would describe it, but didn't have much of a reaction. But the next morning, I was downstairs getting the kids ready for daycare. Leon came down the stairs. He was holding a towel, and I remember he wrapped the towel around me and took my arms and my shoulders and pushed me up the stairs. And at the top of our stairs was our laundry room.
Okay, well, let me stop you there so I can make sure that we have this right. So is he throws a towel kind of around you?
Judge, the counsel kissed the tongue.
I can rephrase, Judge. Tell me what he does exactly with the towel.
He wrapped it around my arms and my chest, not over my head, but around my arms and my chest.
And when he does that, where are your boys?
They were in the living room. At least one of them was in the living room. I believe they were both in the living room, downstairs in the living room.
Excuse me. You mentioned he pushed you up the stairs. What happened when you got to the top of the stairs?
He pushed me into our laundry room.
And what happened once you got in the laundry room?
He began screaming at me. He had his fists raised, and he was picking up laundry and whipping the laundry at me. One of the, I believe it was the dryer door was open, and he slammed the dryer door.
Is he saying anything to you during this time?
He was screaming at me, but I don't recall exactly what he was saying.
And was this because you had rerouted your paycheck?
Yes.
You mentioned he was throwing laundry at you. Did he throw anything else at you?
He threw a toolbox at me.
And how close did that toolbox come to hitting you?
Maybe a foot. I was able to duck, and it hit the wall, sort of next to me and a little bit near my head, but did not hit me.
Did he eventually leave you alone?
He did.
What did you do?
Took the kids, brought them to daycare, and I had asked my mom to be in town
Why did you ask your mom to be in town?
because I was pretty sure that telling him that I rerouted my paycheck would result in him being violent, and I wanted my mom there to help me.
Did you call your mom at that point?
I went to her hotel and picked her up.
And what did the two of you do?
We went down to the courthouse in Pittsburgh, and I got there it's called a protection from abuse, I believe, an order of protection.
And did the police serve that on the defendant?
Yes,
And did that require him to leave your home?
yes,
So once he left the home, did you go back to the home?
I did.
And why did you go back?
That was where all of our possessions were, my kids' clothes and toys and all of my possessions.
When did you make the decision to leave Pittsburgh and go to Chicago?
I believe at the time I was already looking for a job in Chicago. But when this happened, I knew that we had to leave.
Did you all come to some sort of agreement where you would drop the protective order if you could move to Chicago?
Yes.
And did you begin divorce proceedings at that time?
I didn't begin them right away because I had to be living in Illinois for a certain period of time before I was considered a resident and was able to file for divorce. But I had a lawyer and was working toward putting a filing together.
During that time period, did the defendant begin to harass you?
Yes.
Tell me about that.
He would text and call. There were days that it was hundreds of times a day. I would get text messages and phone calls, both to my parents' home phone, to my cell phone. He would call my mother. He would call my office, have my assistant looking for me. He would email me at work.
Did he ever call the police on you?
He did. I don't remember the time period, but he did call them. He would call them and tell them he needed a wellness check and have somebody come to my house to make sure the kids and I were safe.
Why would he do that?
Usually because I would cut off his phone calls with the kids.
Why would you do that?
Because he was inappropriate. Sometimes he would get on the phone and scream at me in front of them. Sometimes he would just say inappropriate things to them, and I would cut off the phone calls.
And did that enrage him?
Sure seemed like it.
So it resulted in him calling and making welfare checks.
Yes.
Did you come to know the detectives in that area pretty well?
I did.
Okay, tell me about that.
I made several police reports throughout the time. My mom also made several police reports throughout the time. I didn't go in every day, but I would go in and show them the text messages and the phone logs so they would know how often he was contacting me.
And did you work closely with a detective by the name of Mark Feynman?
Yes.
And did he become aware of how serious the situation was?
Yes, he did.
Did the defendant not only threaten you, but did he also threaten your parents?
Yes.
What kinds of things would he say to you about your parents?
He told me that he wouldn't just come after me, that he would go after my parents, and that he would torture them in front of me.
Did he begin showing up where you were in Chicago?
Yes.
Did you get a protective order against him in Cook County in Chicago where you were?
Yes, I did.
Why did you do that?
Because he wouldn't leave me alone.
Where were you living at the time?
At my parents' house.
Would he go by your parents' house?
Yes, he would drive by, and if my car wasn't in the driveway, he would start calling me and texting me to find out where I was.
Was he supposed to be around you during that time?
No.
Did there come a time where some detectives with the police department want you to start recording some of the interactions that you were having with the defendant?
I don't believe the police asked me to record anything. I chose to record some of the phone calls
Why?
because they were so threatening. I wanted the police to hear the threats and know how serious it was.
Did I fly up to Chicago and meet with you about 6 to 9 months ago about this case?
Yes.
And during that time period, did you share with me some of the voice calls that you had saved from that time period with the defendant?
Yes.
And then upon coming here today, did I have you review some of those phone calls that were placed on a disc?
Yes.
And did you have an opportunity to do that?
I did.
And do those calls fairly and accurately depict the defendant and his interactions with you during that time period?
Yes.
Now, the first thing, Ms. Morrison, that I had you take a look at was a voicemail recording. Describe for the members of the jury what they're going to be hearing here.
It's a voicemail that Leon left me, essentially threatening me.
Hey, you want to hang up on me because I called your mom uneducated? Go right the fuck ahead. I will have a court order that puts the kids to 10 and cannot keep, you stupid piece of shit. You want to fucking poison our kids? Go right ahead. It will not last that long, you dumb idiot.
Can you talk to us about what we're going to hear next?
I believe it's, again, a recording of a conversation I had with Leon where he is threatening me, threatening to come to Chicago, I believe. kids' next birthdays. Now it's my parents.
Oh, you got me on speaker, so you're recording me someone else is here, huh?
I don't have you on speaker. I have you on speaker because I'm driving.
I've had enough of this fucking bullshit. If you're that fucking scared of me, you should realize I am telling you the fucking truth. I will cut your fucking father's cock off and put it in your dead mother's fucking mouth. I've had enough of this fucking bullshit. You have no clue where I am. You have no clue when I'm coming. You want to test me, Annie? You've made me hit my fucking limit. I asked you to counsel with me. You there?
Yeah.
I asked you to counsel with me. I asked you to work our marriage out. I was sick. It's no, 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 no. And tonight, I have to tell our kids, or especially James, that I'm going to be here tomorrow. And you fucking listen to me. I'm coming next weekend. I want these fucking solicitations gone. Particular gone. I will gladly give you my entire fucking salary as a doctor. You can live in a lap of luxury and do whatever the fuck you want. But if you try to keep me from our kids, Annie, it's fucking game over. Do you understand me?
If I don't drop the supervised visits, is that what you're saying?
I want them gone.
Or what?
You just heard me.
So you're going to kill my parents if I don't get rid of the supervised visits? I mean, you realize you're threatening physical violence, yet you want me to say, oh yeah, he can be around the kids, he's totally fine.
Hey, I'm not gonna fucking touch the kids, Annie.
Leon,
Hey, you be careful what the fuck you say. Be very, very careful.
okay, I'm going to hang up now.
You hang up on me, Annie, and I will execute my fucking plan. So shut the fuck up and listen.
Briefly, Your Honor.
Is it still Mrs. Morrison or?
Yes, that's my legal name, Morrison.
Okay. Ms. Morrison, I'm Matthew Pospisil. Just have a couple of quick questions for you. Now, I know we just listened to those recordings.
Yes.
And at the time Leon was calling you, he was still in Pittsburgh. Is that correct?
I believe there was a time, I believe, yes, all of those recordings, he was in Pittsburgh. It's the best I can recall.
So he was still kind of far away. And you had taken the kids to Ohio?
To Chicago.
To Chicago, Illinois, I'm sorry.
Yes.
So he obviously was rather upset that he couldn't see his children anymore.
I don't know, he agreed to let us move.
But this was not like a court order of him not being allowed to see his children. It was just the move.
He was allowed supervised visits.
Okay. Now, one of the recordings, Leon mentions that he got sick.
Yes.
What kind of sickness?
I assumed at the time he was referring to mental illness.
Has he ever been treated before for mental illness that you know of?
Yes.
Where did he get treatment for? Or where at?
He spent several weeks at the Menninger Clinic in Houston.
And do you know if he ever got a diagnosis from them?
Yes, he did.
And was he given any kind of medication?
I believe so, but I couldn't say for sure.
And at the time he went into Menninger, what was the status of y'all's relationship? Were you done with him at that point, or were you guys still trying to work on it?
No, I was done.
You were done. Now, early on in your testimony, you mentioned that in the early stages of this relationship, you both were rather volatile. So it's safe to assume, oh, you said it was, I'm sorry, you said it was a volatile relationship.
Yes.
Is it safe to assume that you guys both were equally fighting?
It would be safe to say when he screamed at me, I yelled back. Yes.
Okay. And you've mentioned a lot of scenarios that occurred where the violence just escalated and it kept escalating.
Yes.
But you always remained staying with him? You never wanted to leave at those times?
There were plenty of times I wanted to leave.
But you stayed with him?
I did, yes.
You never filed for a divorce until a few years later?
I'm sorry, a few years later from what?
From the initial start of the escalation of violence. Like how long between the first physical alleged altercation before you filed for divorce? Was it about like 6 years?
I believe so.
And throughout this period of time, you stated earlier that you noticed the escalation in his behavior. But you wanted to have a second child with him?
Yes.
And throughout all of this time, you never reached out to the police until towards the end?
The first time I reached out to the police was approximately 9 months before we separated for good.
And that was also about the same time you decided to reach out to your parents as well?
Yes.
And at any point in time, did you think to reach out to Leon's family?
I believe I reached out to them at the same time as I reached out to my family.
Now, you've also testified that you've noticed his pattern of drinking starting to get worse and worse. He was gambling away all his money, and he wasn't home ever. Did that strike you as like a cry for help?
I didn't, at the time, did not think of it as a cry for help, no.
But you can see how that could have been one.
Sustained.
During this period of time, you probably knew Leon the best. Would you agree?
Yes.
And this random change of behavior, you didn't think to alert anybody?
I wouldn't describe it as a random change of behavior. It was a progression.
Progression. So as this behavior got progressively more severe, and you started drinking more, you started spending all the money gambling, you didn't think this was a cry for help.
I'm going to object. It's been asked and answered in the form.
Sustained.
Going back to these recordings, I can't help but notice that they start mid-conversation. Is that fair?
Yes.
So we don't really know what was happening before you started recording. Is that fair to say?
I know what was happening before they started recording.
But we don't have a way of proving that, do we?
No.
How did Leon end up going to Houston to go to, I think you said it was an inpatient mental facility?
Yes.
How did that occur?
After I got the order of protection in Pittsburgh, he really wanted me to drop it because he was afraid that it would affect his medical career. And so I agreed to drop it if he would allow the children and I to move to Chicago.
And then how did he end up going to the facility?
I don't know.
Was that not part of the agreement as well?
It may have been, I just don't recall.
Did you ever reach out to his family and ask them to take him anywhere for help?
I reached out to his family in December of 2012 after he had held the knife to my throat and told them what had happened. And that's when they first came up to Pittsburgh and brought him to Houston for the first time.
And that's when he went to the inpatient program, to the best of your knowledge?
No, he didn't go into the inpatient program until I believe it was September of 2013.
Okay. So after his family came to bring him back to Houston, did you let him come back?
He came back. I didn't let him come back, but he did come back.
Did he move back into the house?
He came back into the house. I believe at the beginning he was sleeping on the couch, but he was in the house, yes.
And at the beginning he was on the couch, so he eventually moved back into the bedroom?
Yes.
And you guys shared a bed together?
Some nights, it's hard for me to recall. We had a guest room, and there were nights I slept in the guest room.
Were you guys still intimate during this time?
I don't recall.
Now, I know you guys filed for divorce in different states, is that correct?
Yes.
Who filed first? If you recall.
I believe Leon filed first. I believe he filed first.
And was it your plan to use these recordings for the custody battle?
No.
But they were available to be used for that time?
I don't recall ever speaking about them in relation to, we really didn't have a custody battle.
Now, you used to work for Fulbright, correct?
Yes.
And then you eventually went to, is it Bayer?
Yes.
Those are rather prestigious firms. Will they have you travel a lot for work? Going to different conferences?
Initially, when I joined Bayer, I traveled, but it tapered off.
So when you first began, when did you start working for Bayer? If you recall.
2010.
would travel for work, would you let Leon stay with the kids?
Yes.
So you trusted him to have visitation then with his children throughout 2010 alone?
At the time, we just had one child.
Just one child?
Yes, I also had, usually got babysitters to take part of the day as well.
And that's because he was still in residency, right? Or no?
At that time, yes.
But you did trust Leon to take care of the kids?
At that time.
One of the quotes I heard from the recording was Leon saying, "I'm going to cut off your father's genitalia and shove it down your mother's throat." Now that's not realistic, is it?
I'm going to object to relevance and form.
It's relevant. You know, whether it's technically relevant. So it's open.
I don't know. I could certainly imagine a scenario. Wasn't there a case with Bobbitt where somebody's genitalia was cut off? So I believe it's possible.
But you didn't actually take that threat as credible from Leon, did you?
I absolutely did.
You realistically thought that that's something he would do?
I realistically thought he would torture my parents in front of me.
While he was 3 states away?
He had told me multiple times I wouldn't know when or where he was coming and that we would need an army to stop him. So yes.
Pass witness, Your Honor.
I have nothing further, Judge.
Next witness.
Judge, at this time, the state rests.